Welcome to the CoStar News Hotels podcast. I'm Natalie Harms, reporter for CoStar News, and I'm joined today by Hannah Smith, a fellow cat lover, a big time baseball fan, and most importantly, for today's conversation, senior analyst at STR, CoStar's hospitality business unit. Hannah, thanks so much for making the time to join me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, the topic we're going to discuss today will actually be familiar to CoStar News Hotels podcast listeners who also tune in to our network's Tell Me More a Hospitality Data podcast, because host Isaac Collazo said in the March episode that he observed that so far this year, group demand has been more distributed and growing outside those top 25 markets. It's been several weeks since Isaac first made that observation. Hannah, why don't you set the scene for us, especially for those who maybe missed that episode of Tell Me More, and then kind of tell us how that trend has further developed over the year?
Absolutely. So, yeah, this is something that Isaac and I started talking about maybe a couple of months ago just to keep an early eye on. It's something we heard anecdotally at an event I was at in Los Angeles, hearing that some of those smaller markets were maybe benefiting more from group demand. And so, of course, he and I are always going to dive into the data. And so we took a look at what happened last year and then what's happened so far this year. Especially last year, I think when we're thinking about group demand last year, kind of the headline number was that group demand was down last year, almost 2%. And that was coming off of 2024, where there was a little bit of momentum and optimism that we were going to continue to see that group growth. And that's just not really what we saw in 2025, especially from Q2 onwards. That's when we really started to see that group demand down. So that's where we wanted to dive a little bit deeper, see if we could find more details of, is this just a handful of markets or is this a widespread trend?
Mhm. Yeah, I think we heard a lot about the return of group demand kind of lined up. So, has it returned, and or how is it returning, I guess?
Yeah, so what we did is I split the markets basically based on market size. So I looked at markets that had a high proportion of meeting space to each hotel room. And this was just within the hotels, so excluding convention centers, anything like that. So we're looking mainly at those smaller groups because we wanted to get at this idea of, are smaller groups still growing where maybe larger groups are taking a step back? So we looked at these markets where there was this high amount of meeting space per each hotel room, and then we categorize them based on that overall market size. So you have very large markets that have a high amount of meeting space. You also have very small markets that, for their size, are kind of punching above their weight in terms of the amount of meeting space they have. So we took these lists. I took out some of the outliers. So, of course, Las Vegas, it's in a category of its own. Maybe we'll talk about that separately someday. But looking at these markets, some of these large markets, just to give an example, you have markets like San Diego, Chicago, Phoenix, Miami, markets that are large markets, but also have a large amount of meeting space. And then some of those small markets that popped up, you have markets like Birmingham, Alabama, Tucson, Jacksonville, Wisconsin Dells. These are markets, again, they're small markets overall, but they have a large amount of meeting space for their size. And so we wanted to look at these two groups, the large and the small. And we saw a pretty clear trend in 2025 where these small markets were up over 3% in group demand, the large markets down about 1.5% in group demand. So there was a pretty clear split. And if you look at that longer term trend, it really was around 2025 that we saw this split where those smaller markets started to do a little bit better. The larger markets started to retreat a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah. So, has that continued then into 2026?
We have seen that continue into 2026. It's not quite as stark because those larger markets did see a little bit of growth to start the year in group demand, but overall, we have seen that split continue as we've come in the first 3 months of the year so far.
So, if we're talking about, the past 12 months, and we're seeing, these smaller markets see uh, group demand rise 3%, which is pretty significant. How is that comparing to the rest of the industry? And, kind of what makes that notable? What makes that a topic of conversation between you and Isaac?
I think what makes it notable is, well, right now, any group growth is certainly notable just because of what we're seeing at the broader market level. I think something else I noticed in the data when I was looking at these small markets is even when they had a month where group demand declined. So last year, for instance, um, small markets grew 8 out of 12 months in group demand. In those months where they declined, they had a greater growth in transient that offset that group decline. We didn't see that in the large markets. In those large markets, when they saw a decline in group demand, it was greater than any growth they saw on the transient side. So I think that may speak to a little bit of a more nimble or flexible strategy that some of these smaller markets have to fill those rooms if that group demand doesn't materialize. So they have this kind of golden combination of strong group demand, but then they have that flexibility of if that group doesn't come in, they're able to adapt and kind of fill those rooms with that transient demand. Whereas large markets, they obviously have a lot more rooms to fill. That may be more difficult.
Yeah, we might be getting into anecdotal territory or even like hypothesizing territory,
Mhm.
but what is happening in these smaller markets? Are groups downsizing and then able to go or moving around? Like, what's happening? Are they new group business? I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, we've heard a few anecdotal things. I think I have my own hypotheses. One of them is certainly that you may have groups getting smaller, especially after COVID. You had groups just had to take up physically more space because of social distancing. And so those groups actually expanded not in attendee count, but just in physical size that they took up. And so we're seeing some of those groups then contract back down into that physical size. So maybe they can fit in a large hotel's convention space, whereas before they had to be in an outside convention center. So that could be something. We have also heard that, and this has been through um, Simpleview and Granicus, some of their research. Um, they mentioned that some of these groups, they want to feel like they're the only group in the market. So if they can be in a smaller market and, everybody downtown is part of this group and they really feel like they are, you know, the only ones in the market and they can really activate the whole market in that way in that whole downtown area, that may be appealing to some groups that, yeah, sure, they could go to Chicago and take up a decent amount of meeting space, but they'll just feel like another group of many in that market. So, this idea of you can have more intimacy in these smaller markets, and that also gives the groups a little bit more flexibility in cost because they have so many more options to choose from if they're looking at a smaller market versus some of these larger markets and larger groups. There's only a handful of markets that maybe you can shop around to.
Mhm. That's a good point. When we were at a recent conference in Atlanta, which obviously is a big market, not a small
Yes.
market, we were like one of a few conferences going on, big
Even
and
in the
and small.
hotel we were in,
Even in the
yes,
hotel, yes.
there were a couple other groups in there.
Yeah, so I see how that's a bit more of an appeal to go somewhere where your group is the group. So you mentioned pricing and some of the factors going into making these decisions. How does that come into play?
So, one of my initial hypotheses was that these smaller markets, maybe they're just benefiting because they're cheaper markets. They're not charging the same rates as, say, a Chicago. But what we
Mhm.
actually found in the data was the opposite. So, pre COVID 2019, the small and large market buckets, they were actually sitting around the same group ADR. It was around $210 to $215 in ADR. Since then, small markets are up 42% in group ADR. They're just under $300, and that outpaced transient growth in the market. We saw the opposite when we look over at the large markets. They were up 23%, still a considerable growth, but not outpacing inflation. And that growth was outpaced by transient growth. So it's not that these hoteliers are just picking, or not hoteliers, excuse me, these groups are just choosing the cheapest markets. They're actually willing to pay a premium in some cases for these smaller markets, whether it's the unique offerings that that market offers, or like we were just talking about, this idea of we are the one group in the market. So getting that more intimate feel.
Mhm. That is very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so we always gotta work in the World Cup angle.
Of
How is that
course.
factoring into group demand this year, especially looking forward to when the games actually begin?
Yeah, looking at this summer, I think we have a couple different areas where group is going to play into the World Cup performance for hotels. You have the actual World Cup demand from FIFA, which I kind of liken to when we see the Super Bowl in a market, you usually have a very high percentage of group demand in that market around the event because it's NFL related demand. So you do have that kind of base of FIFA related demand that is group demand. We have heard anecdotally that there have been some group block cancellations or just reductions in size from the FIFA side. That's not entirely unexpected. This has happened in previous World Cups where FIFA will book a very large room block and then not necessarily end up using all of those rooms. So that is one side of it. The other side is that you may have some corporate demand related to this, where you have a company that they booked out a suite in the stadium, and so they're also going to maybe get a small room block. That's again something that we see at the Super Bowl as well. And then I think you may see some World Cup demand on smaller markets because a lot of these smaller markets are hosting base camps for the World Cup. So a lot of the attention is, of course, on the big host markets, but you have smaller host markets that a lot of them are college towns that still have those sports facilities that are needed by some of these teams in between their matches. So I think you may see some of that World Cup demand and some of that group demand in some of these smaller markets. So that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. And then the other thing we've been talking about is displacement of demand. And we've been talking about this from a transient side as well. It is possible that you'll have groups that maybe normally would have been in a World Cup host market that are moving out. I think the good thing there, or the good news there for hoteliers, is that that corporate and convention demand is typically pretty slow in June, July. So that displacement won't be as significant as it would be if this event was held in, say, September or October.
Yeah, I do wonder if there's going to be maybe not the corporate group, but other smaller group that wants to avoid those World Cup
For sure,
host cities during the summer because I, you know, live in one of them and I'm already a little nervous about my commutes and what the city of Houston will look like
for
during
sure.
World Cup.
Yeah, we think that for transient. And then for group, you've got a whole nother level of logistics of moving around a big group of people all at once that certainly
Mhm.
becomes more difficult when you are hosting a mega event like the World Cup.
Yeah. Well, as we look to the rest of the year, what are y'all watching for as this trend unfolds?
I'm going to be keeping an eye on pricing in particular. I think it's going to be really interesting to see if that pricing growth continues to hold in some of these smaller markets, especially knowing that there is kind of that lag relationship with group pricing where it typically lags transient growth by around 18 months, just because you have that longer booking window and kind of negotiation period when those rates were negotiated. So I'm curious to see kind of what the optimism was when 2026 rates were being negotiated for group. So I'm going to keep a close eye on that, especially in those small markets, to see if that high growth amount continues. And then I am going to keep an eye on whether we see kind of a rebound in some of these larger markets, which we did see a little bit of in Q1. But whether this was just kind of a 1 year blip last year or if this is something that we're going to continue seeing forward, this trend towards the smaller group markets, towards um, more of these smaller groups filling rooms as opposed to those large citywides that are taking over those big cities.
Mhm. Well, while we have you, and as we wrap up this episode, I want to zoom out a little bit, either bigger than group or group adjacent. What else are you looking at these days as it comes to hotel data?
One of the things I was looking at through this analysis and then also just more broadly is San Francisco. There's been a lot of talk about San Francisco for the past 5 to 6 years, just looking at that trajectory of recovery for the market. And I think a lot of folks heard last year that group demand was very positive in San Francisco last year. It was up over 21%. This is also one of the highest priced group markets. It's in the top 5 consistently for group ADR. It's nearly $350 now in 2026. So there was a lot of positive performance in San Francisco. I do want to caveat that with 2024 was a down year for group. So there's been a bit of like a boomerang yo-yo effect in San Francisco of they've had good years and they've had bad years since 2019. And then, of course, looking back to those 2019 levels, group demand is still only sitting at around 82% of 2019 levels. So it's certainly great news that they had such a positive year last year, and that really made a dent in the market's recovery. But looking at that longer term picture, that market still has a decent amount of growth and a decent amount of room in that market to continue to build back a lot of that group base.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for your time today, for shedding some light on what's happening with group demand for hotels. So it was very enlightening. So appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me. Happy to share.
Hi, I'm Davon Reed.
I'm Omari Head.
And I'm Chris Henry.
We're the hosts of the Next Gen and Lodging podcast on the Hotel News Now podcast network. It's a monthly show in which we interview a new generation of hoteliers to get their insights into a variety of disciplines and topics, from finance to food and beverage and hotel operations. Listen to us on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode of the CoStar News Hotels podcast was recorded on May 12th, 2026, and was edited by me, Natalie Harms. Find all hotel industry news at costar.com/hotel news. Subscribe to this and all CoStar News Hotels podcasts wherever you like to listen.